Well, well. I do believe that we are live. Yes. Yes, we are live. All right. Well. Welcome to the Sydney Winston channel. My name is Sydney Winston. I am a humanist, an atheist, and a Zionist. These are the three seculars, I call them. This episode presents lecture number 9 out of a 36-part lecture series on evil, presented by Dr. Charles Mathewes of the University of Virginia. A warm welcome to everybody who's joined me at the start of the show. And I'd like to let you know that after the show, if there's any after the lecture, I should say, if there's any interest, there will be a live hangout room for anyone who would like to join and discuss the lecture or anything else on your mind. So let's get on with it because we're wasting time.
Welcome back. As I said at the beginning of the last lecture, there are two major strands, two major traditions of thinking about evil, theodicy and Christianity. Irenaeus inaugurates one strand and is in many ways the most important thinker in that group. The primary instigator of the other and far more influential strand is St. Augustine of Hippo, philosopher, rhetorician, theologian, bishop, public official, if not the greatest Latin writer ever, at least, as the church historian Jaroslav Pelikan once put it, the greatest man ever to write Latin. Now, Augustine is known for many, many things. Probably he's perhaps best well known as the great theorist of human interiority. And he introduces the idea that in some important way, motiveless evil is worse than evil that seems to have a rationale. And also that the true locus of evil's badness lies not in the effects evil has in the world, but in the derangement of the will that it affects on the person who does it. In this lecture, especially, even though it may not be clear right away, we are talking about a view that you already know a great deal about, a view that you are already quite familiar with, precisely because Augustine has been such a profound shaping influence for the way that people in the West, anyway, think about themselves, the world, history, and the nature of evil and sin. St. Augustine is sometimes called the second founder of the Christian faith, and for good reason. For Western Christianity, Augustine's influence has been profound, though never without its critics, especially in the past century or so. But nonetheless, he's one of the greatest thinkers in the West of any religious or philosophical persuasion you may care to mention on evil, and with good reason, for his eye saw its own share of evil. He was born in 354 in a backwater town of North Africa to a Christian mother and a non-Christian father. As far as we can tell, his father was non-Christian anyway. He was primed from an early age by his parents to use his education and his brain power, which was clearly substantial, to raise his social standing. And raise it he did. He was trained as a rhetorician, a teacher, a professor of rhetoric, and he eventually became a professor of rhetoric and taught first in Rome and then in the imperial capital of the late Roman Empire of Milan, where he once actually gave a speech praising the emperor in the emperor's presence. right? A command performance, a sort of very high status thing to do. But he found this way of life increasingly unsatisfactory, and he was drawn increasingly to his mother's Christianity. He marked his own conversion at the age of 32, and after that he quit his job, he quit his teaching post pretty quickly, and retired with his friends first to a patron's estate outside of the city of Milan, and then he went back to Africa to set up a sort of lay monastery and think tank where he and his friends would live celibate lives together, eat, pray, work, read, and talk. But after a few years of this very happy retirement, he was forced to accept a sort of vice-bishopric, a vice-bishop role in the city of Hippo on the North African coast. He was visiting the city, and he was in a church for a church service that day, and the bishop of the city pointed Augustine out in the crowd and said to the crowd, "Don't let that man leave. We know who he is. He's Augustine, right? From Tagaste, the place where he had his monastery. He's Augustine. Don't let him leave until he agrees to become my assistant and then eventually my replacement." And in fact, that's what the crowd did. They compelled him to stay until he consented to first become a priest and then become their coadjutor bishop, the vice bishop, and then the main bishop of the city of Hippo for almost 40 years until he died. In that position, he rose to prominence, first in North Africa, then across the Latin West, to the point that he was known as the major Latin-speaking theologian that the church in the Greek East had to respect. Never without controversy, he debated fiercely a number of rival views throughout his career. He wrote enormously influential books, The Confessions, The Massive City of God, a huge book on the Trinity, essays, innumerable commentaries on books in the Bible. He regularly gave sermon after sermon, some of them lasting hours. And he could apparently keep the people pretty captivated. The sermons are pretty good, I must admit. And we only have a few hundred of these, though we know he gave thousands over the course of his almost 40 years as a preaching bishop. And he also wrote very influential letters. Interestingly, Augustine's letters and sermons, not his texts, but the letters and sermons are still occasionally discovered today. Just in the spring of 2008, in fact, a new series of, I think, 4 or 5 sermons were found collected in an old manuscript book of quote-unquote great sermons you can use, compiled for medieval preachers in Germany. It's an astonishing thought to think that this man who was so profoundly influential, all of his works were read avidly. There are still things out there that are yet to be found, yet to be known, and that might still be waiting in some monastery somewhere. Now, to understand Augustine's views, it will help to contextualize them in their setting, to put them in the setting in which they were first formulated and for which he formulated them, that is, African Christianity in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. Much of this tradition is readily captured in an earlier African theologian, Tertullian, and in particular, his vision of evil is one that, in a complicated way, again, shadows Augustine's. You have to understand Tertullian's views in order to see where Augustine is coming from in his thinking. There are other shadows behind Augustine, and we'll talk about them later. Again, like Irenaeus, he's shadowed by the Gnostics in a certain way. But look at Tertullian first. First of all, Tertullian thought that the human is confronted with the bare fact of their responsibility for evil. Adam's fall is his own fault alone. For humans were created entirely free to choose good or evil. And along with this simple responsibility comes a simple punishment. After the fall, humanity does suffer evils, of course, but they are all well merited, and clearly so for Tertullian. Most interestingly, and this is the part of Tertullian's work which has gotten him in most trouble, Tertullian has a very troubling vision of the ultimate punishment of evil. It's a vision that is deeply disturbing in lots of ways and was famously assaulted by Friedrich Nietzsche almost 1,600 years after Tertullian wrote it. Tertullian, in the midst of critiquing the spectacles of Rome, that is, the shows, the plays, the gladiatorial contests that amused people in Rome of his time, including the visual displayed martyrdom of Christians that pagan Rome repeatedly engaged in, right? Famously, the Christians thrown to the lions in the floor of the Colosseum or what have you. Tertullian suggests that hell will be the true spectacle, and one that all true Christians will find themselves delighted to see, when those on the floor of the stadium will be the sinners who have suffered, who have caused Christians to suffer in this life. Now they, the sinners, will be suffering on the floor of the stadium, while the blessed in heaven sit on the stands and watch and enjoy the suffering of the damned, of the sinners. In fact, the watching of the suffering of the damned for Tertullian constitutes, or so it seems, a significant part of the happiness of those who are blessed. In other words, and it seems to me Nietzsche was right to notice a kind of theological inconsistency about this, Tertullian wants to say that the whole point of hell, in a way, is to be a spectacle for the blessed who will be able to delight in the sufferings of the damned. This is, as Nietzsche pointed out, a view of good and evil which is incredibly laced with resentment about those who are causing suffering to the Christians in that day. It's also profoundly punitive and really quite psychologically disturbing. In contrast to this, Augustine offered another very influential, very different story of evil, one that rendered it much more obscure. On his view, the fall is a mystery. Punishment in this life is universal, but obscurely distributed. And ultimately, God's justice and mercy will be revealed in salvation. But until then, the obscurity of the relationship between the suffering we experience in this life and the merit we have deserved, the reason we have deserved the suffering, that is completely obscure. And Augustine doesn't want us to try to interpret too much how the things of this life communicate some status we have before God. So, Tertullian and North African Christianity is one background out of which Augustine is coming. The other context out of which Augustine himself emerges, and which is always there in the background of his thought, is his own youthful attachment to a certain kind of Gnostic popular religion called Manichaeanism. Now, we don't need to worry about the details of Manichaeanism, but let me just say this. It was, like many of the other ancient Near Eastern stories, it was a combat myth picture of the universe. There was a dualist faith. Matter is evil, spirit is good. The universe that we know was created out of this battle. In fact, the world that we inhabit and all matter that we feel is composed, in the myth of the Manichaean creation myth, is composed out of the skins of the corpses of the archons of darkness. Such a great line, the archons of darkness. It sounds like a rock band or something. In contrast to this view that Augustine had himself dallied with as a young man, Augustine insisted that in fact matter is good because a good God created all, right? Augustine again affirms the Hebrew Bible as part of the true revelation of the real God. Good and evil are not metaphysical rivals for Augustine, but all that is, insofar as it exists, is good. It's just that things exist on a continuum of levels of being. Rocks do not have the same quality of existence as plants do, and therefore they are not as good in some metaphysical way as plants. But that doesn't mean that they're bad, it just means that they're of a lower level of being. Now, to articulate his own view, Augustine makes two fundamental claims about sin and evil. Let's talk about them both in turn. The first claim is that evil is essentially privational. That's a weird word. It means it is an irrational swerving from a wholly good creation that deprives that creation of some quality of being. Evil, that is ultimately a nothing, annihilation, wholly lacking being. Essentially, nothing more than the privation of some fundamentally good reality. The evil of an act is simply how the act lessens existence in some way. If I hit a child, the consequence of my act is that the child will mistrust people more, maybe begin to feel that if adults use violence in this way, then the child can use violence in this way too, beating up her or his classmates. And thus, I have damaged the web of human relations and affections in ways that have weakened that web, made it thinner, more fragile. I have deprived that web of human relations and affections of being. I have also lessened the soul of that poor child. And also, Augustine will say, and we'll see why in a little while, I have lessened my own soul as well. A similar thing will happen if I lie. A lie undiscovered misleads people and so loosens their grip on reality, making them less effective in the world, less able to bring the world's goodness to fruition. If the lie is discovered, of course, then their trust in me is lessened. I have seemed to them less reliable as a person, and again, the web of human affairs has been damaged. Furthermore, when I tell a lie, even if it's believed only for a moment, my trust in the reliability of the world is by extension also damaged, because if I can fool people, then they can fool me too. In all of this, Augustine wants to insist there is no metaphysical substantiality to evil. There's no rival metaphysical center of power and gravity named evil over against God. Augustine clearly believed in demons. He clearly believed that Satan is a power and a force, but he understood those demons and Satan as rival spirits who are rebelling against God, but still, nonetheless, under God's sovereign control, in this moment as well as ultimately. This all goes back, of course, through Augustine to the first chapter of Genesis and to the idea that this is a God who simply orders the world to be created, and it is created. Augustine, in fact, is one of the first major Christian thinkers to develop this Genesis account into the Christian account of what's called the creation ex nihilo, a creation out of nothing, right? He does this to oppose the more pessimistic Manichaean view that, in fact, the creation is, again, made out of the corpses of the defeated enemies of light. But, of course, the irony is that he also creates a situation where there begins to be a differing Christian and Jewish conception of what Genesis looks like, how that first creation myth goes. So for Augustine, Satan is not fundamentally a rival deity to God. Satan is God's rebellious servant who still in some mysterious way serves God's sovereign providence. Just as God created all and called it good, as God is the source of all, there can be nothing, not even Satan, even in Satan's original being, right, in Satan's good being, that is not in some sense good in God's eyes. Is being itself, that is, the character of being and goodness for Augustine are the same thing. He's not saying here that everything that is nothing but good. He recognizes that lions are not good to the prey that they fall upon. But the reality of existence itself is a very, very good thing for Augustine. That's the first and most basic affirmation. And because the reality of existence itself is fundamentally good, evil has to be nothing, has to be an attempt to annihilate that goodness. The second claim he makes, along with the privation theme, is sometimes called the perversion theme. For Augustine, if evil is nothing, sinful people are still perverted towards wanting nothing. They are turned away from what they should want and aim their lives at wanting things which are empty, meaningless, finally, ultimately, nothing. Sin, then, is the perversion of an originally wholly good human nature. Now, as we saw, in Judaism, the possibility of human temptation and failure is built into human nature from creation forward. Adam and Eve do not originate evil. They are just the first examples of a pattern that human history will show again and again. Augustine follows Paul. Any mark of human weakness or frailty is a consequence of the primordial calamity of the fall of Adam and Eve. As perversion, then, human wickedness, ironically, always bears the appearance of an intelligible good. This is really important. And I actually think this is one of the most philosophically difficult and deep statements that Augustine makes, and in fact, probably anybody makes. The crucial psychological point here is this. For a human to do something, an act must have a reason. If it's not just a hiccup or a reflex, like kicking a knee up when a doctor taps it with a hammer, the doer of the deed must have some justification. No one thinks of himself or herself as bad, as acting from bad motives. The great pre-World War II movie, French movie called The Rules of the Game, made by the writer and artist Jean Renoir. And in that movie, the character that Renoir plays says to someone else a wonderful and very Augustinian line. He says, "The truly terrible thing about this life, monsieur, is that everyone has their own reasons." I'm not saying that people need a perfect justification for what they do, a complete one that anyone would endorse. But we need an account that gives us at least the appearance on its surface of a momentarily plausible rationale for doing what we do. Right? This is why one of the most common, and in some ways, one of the most psychologically illuminating statements humans can make is the statement, "It seemed like a good idea at the time." Right? Everything we do seems like a good idea at the time. And Augustine thinks this is very deep because it is impossible, he thinks, for someone to want to do evil just because it is evil. Radical nihilism of this sort is ruled out. And this is important because we'll see later on certain figures in the tradition, especially Satan as represented by John Milton, do try to say things like, "Evil be thou my good." Satan actually says that in Milton's Paradise Lost. But Milton's point is actually very Augustinian. The reason Satan says that is precisely because he wants to be as far from God as possible. So he's trying still to affirm himself by saying, "Evil be thou my good." That is, on Milton's Augustinian reading of Satan, Satan is saying, by using those words, Satan is saying, "I am the most important person in the world, and I value me very highly because of it." Right? Another much more mundane example, consider a lover and his or her beloved. A lover can be jealous of his or her beloved's other friends and envy and begrudge every other person any time that they spend with the beloved. From the lover's perspective, this isn't a problem, right? This attention doesn't seem bad. It's genuine love for the beloved person. But from an outside observer's perspective, possibly also the beloved's own point of view, it is bad. It's an excess of attention that is destructive, maybe obsessive. Maybe it's scaring the beloved. Why are you so around me all the time? But it is, in fact, Augustine would say, an excess of a real good, the good of caring. Sure, that real good is warped in certain ways. It's perverted in certain ways. But from the perspective of the lover, the fact that they see a real good being affirmed in their attention here is what makes it so hard for someone in the grip of such a perversion to see it as bad. Because for them, it looks like they can give a good account of what they're doing. "I just love you," right? This is why police are terrified to get involved in domestic abuse, domestic conflict situations, because they know that it's people who understand themselves to be loving each other the most who are going to be the most dangerous in situations of violence. Now, ironically, this picture really does mean, despite its kind of dark psychology in some ways, it really does mean that Augustine has a relatively optimistic picture of human behavior. If sin is merely a perversion of humanity's originally good nature, that makes it more difficult to eliminate, more difficult to fix, because those who are caught in the grip of sin cannot see that, often they cannot see that what they're doing is bad. But it also means that, ironically, humans are not completely gone astray from the good path. Because at least in terms of how they think about what they're doing, they still have to think about it in terms of a good end. Now, this concept lies behind Augustine's profoundly ironic view of human history. Particularly in his, again, vast text, The City of God. History turns out to be a story of humanity who are trying or are being taught to unlearn their efforts to be their own God, their own rulers, which is why, for Augustine, as with the book of Revelation and going back to the Tower of Babel, empires figure so large in human history. Empires, for Augustine, just like this earlier tradition, are really ultimate expressions of human rebellion, precisely because they are devices we use to avoid imagining that we need to be dependent upon God. Now let's be clear. Evil is not mere appearance on this account. The logic of perversion functions in a way to secure the reality of evil. Evil, though, in its effects, is simply the lessening of being, its diminution. Evil is simply the name we give to the diminishing force that attacks being itself. The devils, for Augustine, turn themselves into small and puny creatures compared to the great and powerful angels they were initially. The great example of this, in fact, is the famous pear tree incident in Augustine's autobiographical book, The Confessions. In this story, which is recounted in Book 2 of that very, very famous book, Augustine compares the crimes of he and his friends in stealing pears from a neighbor's tree to the great crimes of Roman history, especially the terrible crimes of the tyrant Sulla. Now, Sulla in Roman history is basically as bad as it gets. Sulla was the evil tyrant who sent his gangs, once he had taken control of the city of Rome, sent his gangs through the city, picking out people they didn't like, killing them, killing their families, and taking their property. How is it possible that Augustine and his friends, sneaking into a neighbor's garden and stealing pears that he himself says were about to fall from the tree, they were in some ways overripe pears, and not necessarily eating them, but just tossing them on the ground? How is that worse than a tyrant terrorizing the city of Rome? This is the audacity of Augustine's account. He and his friends' evil was even worse than Sulla's, because their wickedness lacked even the appearance that Sulla's did of rationality. Sulla at least had material aims, right? He wanted power, he wanted wealth, he wanted to defeat potential enemies that motivated his cruelty, his savagery, right? Sulla, that is a demon that is in some ways comfortingly intelligible to us. Augustine and his friends just went into the garden to destroy. They didn't have any aims beyond the mere destruction of another person's property. Augustine reads this as the epitome of human evil. He does think that there was a positive account. He spends a few moments thinking about this. He does think finally there's a positive way he can account for what they did. They did it out of love for each other. They did it because out of a kind of desire to be a gang together, by doing something bad, they joined in a kind of tighter fellow feeling, right? Which again is a psychologically acute insight about teenage depredation and crime. But more importantly, Augustine thinks what was going on was a crime that really didn't have much motive. And that's what made it so terrifying. Some of the pears they took and bit, some of them they just threw away. By the way, what might Augustine be alluding to with the story of his friends and he taking someone else's fruit from a tree? This raises a question for us, Augustine's story and his insistence that he and his friends were worse than Sulla. Is motiveless evil worse than motivated evil? But within what register is this evil worse? Augustine's story here marks a very important moment in the history of thinking about evil. It marks what we can call the radical interiorization of evil. For Augustine is the first person, it seems to me, to really suggest that the outward manifestation of evil, what the consequences of the evil are, right, Sulla's slaughter of Romans versus their taking of pairs that were about to fall away anyway, that outward manifestation may somehow be less important than what evil does to one's soul. Perhaps, in fact, the outward manifestation may be of completely low importance, minimal importance, maybe no importance at all. What does it mean to say that evil is truly a matter of what happens inside the soul? What does it mean to say that unmotivated evil, an evil which lacks any obvious material cause, is in some ways the most terrifying kind of evil? Well, again, you can go back to the early myths that Christians and Jews had. It's not quite in Scripture, but the early myths they had about the fall of Satan. You can connect it up with the story of Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. These sorts of figures seem not fully coherent. Satan's fall seems utterly incoherent to us. It doesn't make any sense at all. That's the real scary thing for Augustine. The real scary thing is when people don't even try to make sense of the evil that they do. But if this is so, a question that haunts a lot of Augustine's writings, a lot of his thought, is that there seems to be some mysterious parallel between that kind of completely anarchic evil, an evil without a beginning, without a rationale, and God's mysterious providence as well. Maybe, in fact, human evil is a parallel way, a parallel that imitates God's mysterious providence in history. So Augustine explains that the fundamental principles of the cosmos are not to blame for evil. But what I pointed out about the story of Adam and Eve is also true about Augustine, even more so. The cost of securing God from responsibility for human evil is to make that evil profoundly mysterious. Furthermore, because he focuses on inner evil, the corruption of the inner self as the root of outward misbehavior, he makes evil even more mysterious and perhaps more remarkable. It's not too far to say, in fact, that evil is remarkable for Augustine in unprecedented ways. Indeed, in one way, often unappreciated by people who read him, part of his aim is precisely to make evil more remarkable. As he says in The City of God, the difficult task we face is how to learn how not to know the reason for evil. What does he mean by that? He means that in our world, it is all too easy to understand evil actions, where understanding means not finding them at all remarkable, explaining them, giving an account of them, and in some ways explaining them away, not finding them astounding. But Augustine wants us to find evil actions remarkable because he thinks they are remarkable. They are astounding. They are a remarkable, mysterious fact about us, and not a good fact. All too often, we find good acts in need of explanation, but not evil ones. That, for Augustine, just shows the extent of our sickness. In a decent world, we would find good actions natural, logical, and wholly reasonable, and cruel or indifferent actions astonishing. The extent to which we do not, the extent to which we are calloused to evil and astonished by goodness, just reveals the depth of sin in which we are sunk for him. Let me conclude. The epistemological optimism of this view, that is, the hope that we can, in fact, know the rationales of our actions, and yet also we can know that evil is, in some fundamental way, mysterious, completely empty of meaning, is complemented by a certain kind of anthropological pessimism that is, a picture of the human that insists that human nature now, after the fall, can't by itself be good. Furthermore, the interiority of the self on Augustine's picture is very, very profound and amplified. He is in some ways, in this as in many other ways, the master of interiority. The question for Augustine is really about whether we are the sorts of people who have or can have a mysterious sort of depth. Now, in the next two lectures, we'll look at two rival pictures of evil. One developed by the Jewish rabbis in the same time roughly that Augustine and Irenaeus are writing, and one developed by Islamic thinkers a few centuries later. Two accounts that offer really quite profound contrast to these works. So let's turn to those next.
Right. That was super interesting. Augustine, that's kind of a lot to take in. So as you see, we have a situation where we are able to go and have a conversation, if you like. We do have the outside chat going. Just Wesley Curry II. He's the only visitor so far. And to join the room, I guess would be a good idea for me to put the link. Okay, to join the room, you could join by phone if you're in North America. Or you could join with the Google Meet, either app, the app, I guess, which I'll pin to the top of the chat. So, so far we certainly have seen evidence for evil, lots of evidence for evil. But we've seen no evidence for Jesus. So far, I'm standing by my claim. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, hello, algorithm, how are you? Why don't you join? Come on in. In a bit. Well, I don't know. In a bit means pretty soon, hopefully, because I don't want to just keep on rambling to myself if no one's going to join. But anyway, I just wanted to say that I stand by my statement below. Evil exists after 9 lectures. That's a quarter of the way through the whole lecture series of 36 lectures. We have seen many examples of different views of evil. Oh, at work. Okay, well, that's fine. Yeah. At work, what? All right. So late at night, my time is pretty much the best time for you. I can't figure it. I have no idea. Can you guys move your island like a couple of time zones closer or something? Because I have no idea what time you guys are in. I know you're probably in tomorrow, but as far as what time you are, man, actually I could work it out. So you're probably 3:40, 3 and 5. I'd say you're about 8:40 a.m. 20 to 9? How close am I? Come on, tell me. That was just a rough calculation based on my inadequate mathematics. So what? So again, I just added 17 hours. That's probably the Sydney time zone that I think I've targeted. But I don't know if my maths is correct. If you could, L, just let me know what time it is. But yeah, I got off track, so I'll have to start again. The message below, I stand by. Evil exists. We've got 9 episodes, 9 lectures into a 36 lecture series. We have evidence of evil because multiple people talk about it and try and figure it out, try and find goodness in evil, believe it or not. Satan is revealed to be the absolute and total opposite of God. He has to get as far away from God as possible because God is evil. It's amazing, actually, the way that all of it really points to, so far, no Jesus, but sure, hell yeah, there's evil. Well, if no one's going to join, okay, let me just say this. There's 36 lectures in this series that I want to throw up, that I want to live stream. And this is number 9. So if there's no one going to join the room, the hangout, that's fine. I'll just stop it right here and go and do something else. And the lecture number 10 will come in whenever. So that's what we're going to do. Bye-bye.